I want to thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. In the graduate school, we are super excited to not only recognize but also celebrate LGBT History Month. And so, in line with that, we're thrilled to have Dr. Alan Thomas from the Department of Learning Communities right here at UCA speaking to us in his talk titled Making Space. Dr. Thomas, I know, has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and then a master's and a PhD in counseling psychology.
Mhm.
But I suspect you're going to share a whole lot more about yourself. So I'm not going to say much more than that. And I'll just say thank you and turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Dr. Barlow. This is a really awesome opportunity. I like to talk, which is somewhat different than how people saw me when I grew up. But I've learned to, come into my own and have fun with these ideas, as, heartbreaking as some of this might be. But I am very grateful to share the space with y'all. And even if I can't see you, I imagine we are all together in spirit. So yeah, without further ado, let's talk about making space through the lens of LGBTQ experiences in graduate school. So some things I wanted to preface are, for one, we're going to talk about some difficult topics. So here's how I usually parse that when I talk with my students. For one, it's important for us to mention the specific things that may come up today. So that can include things like suicide, which we will have a very frank discussion about, homophobia or homo-antagonism, transphobia or trans-antagonism, transmisogyny, biphobia, bi-antagonism or bi-erasure, antagonism towards pansexual people, and ace erasure. A quick note about the language here, you may see some people advocate for not using phobia in terms of designations of bigotry or marginalization. From a clinical standpoint, I somewhat agree with that and also not. And so you might hear me switch these words. And so discussing things like homo-antagonism are other words that people have used to signify bigotry toward gay people and lesbians or towards trans folks, so on and so forth. That doesn't use the phobia suffix. But as we broach these topics, I do want you to check in with yourself and see how you feel, because it is important for us to acknowledge our emotional reactions to this information, or any kinds of information, honestly. So what I encourage you to do from there is check in with your emotions and check out if you need to. Of course, I can't see you, so that means that if you don't have your camera on, that's not bad. But I encourage you to go get a drink of water if you need to. Maybe doodle or take some notes. Stand up, get a deep breath, step outside if you can. Do what you need to be able to stay with us in this space as much as possible, to be with us as part of the conversation, but also to maintain your own healthy boundaries as we discuss things like marginalization or suicidality. From there, let me know if I need to make adjustments. I did some fine-tuning of my slides before we got started today. I wanted to make sure that things were visible for you, and of course that you could hear me as we do this presentation, because accessibility is really important to me, even as I endeavor to challenge myself to be better around it, like providing alternate text for images in slides. So again, if you need me to make adjustments, I'm more than okay to do that. I can just pause real quick and do what I need to. From there, please ask me questions in the chat during the presentation. I love questions. They are really helpful, and especially in terms of conversations like this, where maybe I didn't cover something that would be helpful for you to know, or you have a burning question on your mind that we didn't address. Perfect opportunity to do that. I'll try to be mindful of time. I can really get to talking sometimes, especially about stuff like this. But I do want to leave some time for questions, and I do encourage you to ask difficult questions. If they are visible to other people, I just want you to be mindful of the language that you use and how you approach it. As far as I'm concerned, there's very few things in the world that really cross boundaries for me in an egregious way. So I really am open to very difficult or challenging questions. So I do encourage you to ask those if they are on your heart or your mind or your chest. From there, I will give you a brief introduction for myself. I am a triple UCA alum, as Dr. Barlow pointed out. I like to say that because I think it's a funny, maybe tongue-in-cheek way to approach it. But yes, all three of my degrees are from UCA. So I've been here since 2006, and I've occupied a wide variety of roles in that time, from student to intern to staff member to faculty member. Specifically, I have a counseling background from my counseling PhD, and that is where most of my expertise is. So I was trained in diagnosis, I was trained in various treatment modalities, how to seek care for other people using different resources. So there's a wide range of things that I can do with my degree, but it is mostly housed in counseling psychology. I will definitely tell you though, in terms of currently being an educator and administrator, I use those skills all the time. Whether it comes to communication and what words to use, or how to reach out to someone and have a difficult conversation, I am constantly using these skills. And honestly, for topics like we're going to talk about today, it can be very difficult for many of our incoming students, who I primarily teach, to navigate sexual orientation in a place like Arkansas, away from their families, often for the first time. And so I'm happy to be a sounding board for those students, or really for anyone, because I think questioning is more than normal. Just sometimes we might need a little bit of help with it. Aside from that, I am a huge nerd. You can see a little bit of my Sailor Moon shirt. I love anime, I love video games. I just really, really love nerdy things. They light up my world. And I think that's where I got my expansive imagination from. I made a joke yesterday that I can understand the dimensions of, or in timelines of X-Men, and that's something not a lot of people can do. And for me, it's kind of like second nature. But that's another way I use my own mind and imagination in the work that I do, because I like to make connections and figure out how can we use two things that are seemingly disparate and bring them together, see what those connections are. So with that being said, I did want to present something to you. So I have a question for you, and that is, what do you think are the top 3 issues for LGBTQ grad students in particular? So again, if you named 3 primary issues, they could be barriers, they could be challenges, however you want to frame it, what would be the top 3 for many of our LGBTQ grad students in particular? All right, we have some good ones, and so let's roll with those. First one I see is feeling valued. I think that's absolutely true. And that's something that can be a very poignant thing for someone, or just woven into our human experience. There's a lot of what we experience that is not just located at a particular position for certain communities. Sometimes that is very much the truth. We all have differential needs based on who we are, how we grow up, and the resources that we have. But that's what we also see, is that there's some stuff that is to some degree universal. I don't think that's a question that is uncommon for people. But considering for LGBTQ people, why might the idea of feeling valued come up? Isolation is a very big one. Last night at the coming out event that we had in conjunction with PRISM and other RSOs and departments on campus, isolation and loneliness was a common theme. It's something I'm actually about to talk about, so that's a really good one. And it's easy to feel isolated in a graduate program for a lot of different reasons as an LGBTQ person. Feeling comfortable and accepted, absolutely. It is not always easy to find a space for yourself if one exists. Sometimes you have to carve one out, and maybe those tools are not really helpful for you. So finding out ways to be able to connect with people and keep yourself intact, I think that's real. Being for fully online or out of town or out of state students, there we go. Lack of access to on-campus resources, yes. Especially if you're not familiar with a campus in any way or from undergraduate, then it can be difficult to find where to go or who can help you out. On top of, might you experience marginalization as part of that process? Is it one where you're going to be completely safe? That's not always clear, and sometimes it can make it really difficult to navigate this environment. And from there, we have feeling tied to societal norms and not being able to be freely open. Absolutely. That's a very common issue for people. Again, there might be particular shades based on someone's race, their gender, their disabilities, if they occur in various modalities, their amount of money. But the norms that we exist with, especially here in the South, can be very difficult to navigate. And what I found through, my own personal growth, a couple of years of therapy, but also my education in psychology and working with students, is that those norms are invisible. They're not tangible in a lot of ways. Kind of like anxiety, when it creates a wall for us, there's no physical wall there, but there's a lot of feelings, right, that are very difficult to wade through or navigate. Well, so are those norms. And for queer and trans folks, the added issue might be, could I be harmed from this? May I lose a resource from this? Is someone going to threaten me with death or, try to cause my death? Those are completely realistic questions. And sometimes they can be very difficult to parse. But they exist at the background for many folks, especially our trans siblings, dealing with navigating gender in a world very, very tied to the idea of a gender binary and nothing else. So you'll see some shades of this throughout the presentation. Again, I'll try to be mindful of time because I imagine my talking is just about to start, but I think these are really great ideas and they are helpful for framing what we're going to talk about. Because one thing you might find is, do we actually know specifically what issues are for LGBTQ grad students in particular? We'll find out in a couple of slides. So what I'd like to do from there is talk about my experiences. Like I said, I love to talk. I really do like to talk about myself, though I try not to be too self-aggrandizing. I think I use that word right. But in terms of how to shape this presentation, I did want to include, well, what it was like for me. First off, it was very lonely. Now, there are definitely some personal factors that influence that. I am a heavy introvert, like pretty much on the extreme of introversion. I really, really like my alone time. So part of that, not so terrible, but loneliness is different from willingly being alone. And it was very lonely to figure out, well, who is in my corner? Or if I spoke about my story or how I felt about something, was someone going to listen to me? Would someone have my back? And that was a very difficult thing to parse. And so I did play some things closer to the chest, and I was not always outspoken. I found other ways to put myself out there and show what my skills were. It was a little precarious, not necessarily outright, because sometimes it's hard to tell. But I do want you to know the fear is real enough, and the fear is enough to create psychological symptoms. So in thinking about that, the fear of marginalization is very real. And so I don't know if it was actually precarious, but I kind of was prepared for something to go foul for me on the basis of being queer in a program. To that note, I do want to say that, yes, I did graduate from here, and I'm very clear about my language in talking about my experiences. So to that effect, what you hear from me is exactly what I have to say. There's no hidden meaning or anything like that. So I'm telling the honest truth from my perspective. And I feel the need to say that partially because the precarious nature of being queer on a college campus, especially here in the South. I don't know if that's actually going to be an issue, but it is still one that I need to be prepared for. And that can be really difficult. Through my experience, I became really independent in terms of my research and how to seek things out. When you want to study comics and queerness, not always easy to find mentors. So what I'm very grateful for is I had folks like Dr. Elston Bim, who gave me the room and the latitude to explore things that I wanted to explore. And he gave me a great foundation for that as well. So I'm very grateful for him and working as a research assistant for him for a couple of years. But what that allowed me to do was feel a little bit more confident in my skills, figure out how do I want to study things or what can I do? And I developed a lot of my research skills, of course, as I was going through the program, but I thought about different questions and how to ask them. And in particular, how do I ask them with queer people, especially queer people of color? So some pros and cons. I was left alone, but I was also left alone. It's not like people purposely put me to the side, but when you don't quite know who to talk to and you already live in existence where you're highly introverted and you like being alone, it's not hard for that to happen. And honestly, I'm not sure what I would have asked for, but I think the way to change that would have been me being willing to speak up a little bit more, but it's not always easy. Few questions for new research, which I loved. So one of the really awesome things about studying queerness or things like comic books and video games is when you are in a department where other folks aren't doing as much research on that, it's a lot more curiosity than really hard questions. And I coasted with that. I'm not even going to lie. I love developing new ways of studying this stuff. And it also created a way for me to, not be so anxious all the time when I was presenting. And I don't think that could have happened without the level of independence that I got. So again, I'm very grateful for that aspect of my experience. So I developed skills for independent research, but not quite for collaboration. And that's for a couple of reasons. Again, I like to do things by myself, and it almost felt like a necessity. But on top of that, I wasn't always sure how to work with people who may not like what I liked, which another thing I'm grateful for in the grad program is that I did have someone with me who liked to study comic books. So for a couple of years, we did comic book research together, and it was awesome. So having someone to work with was really monumental. And with her, I could be open. We could talk about the difficulties of our experiences. And I never felt like she was going to judge me for it or treat me negatively or, go run her mouth about it. And of course, vice versa. So my experience definitely is influenced by being queer, by being Black, and by being Black and queer. And it also had some hallmarks of a queer experience in general, but especially in academia: the loneliness, the isolation, the fear of issues. My first practicum site was at a religious organization, and you can bet your bottom dollar I kept very quiet about being queer. When you are doing work for a place that has mandatory and scheduled Bible study, it doesn't always feel quite safe to be out. And so I kept quiet. I didn't really talk to anyone about it, and I did the best job I could. For the most part, I was okay, and I didn't have to worry about anything. And I did have later supervisors who I felt more open with. But yeah, that was one of the things I was worried about. It already took a lot to get that practicum site, so could I potentially lose it by talking about being queer? That wasn't an easy thing to parse, so I did what I thought was safe, and I mean, it worked out for me. I just stayed quiet, and I didn't really showcase that part of myself, which part of me laments it, and at the same time, I am proud of myself for surviving and getting through that semester. All in all, it wasn't a terrible experience, but that was something that was on my mind. So when thinking about my experiences, I know that that's one aspect of how we can approach things, but I'm one person. There's 7.8 billion people on this planet. In terms of queer people, there's about 2 to 4% of the population. I think that's the general metric. So what might those other experiences look like? Or what are some things that we're going to look for? Well, as I approach these topics, I like to think about this in terms of mental health and psychology. So what is impacting health and well-being? Or what are the things we're contending with in our general lives that might also influence our experience in terms of academia and education? So in general, when you look at stats around LGBTQ mental health, of course, I studied stuff like this for my dissertation, which was done 6 years ago. But of course, I also refreshed myself on research to see what trends might be. Are things different? And they're about the same or worse. The pandemic in particular did a number on everyone, but it did a specific, or it had a specific kind of toll on queer and trans folks. So in general, what we see are higher rates of anxiety, depression, and substance use. The anxiety and depression are often explained by fear of reprisal, issues with identifying with queerness or transness, issues with resources or the potential threat or fear of losing them. So the anxiety and depression make a lot of sense here. With substance use, yes, there are higher rates of substance use for LGBTQ folks compared to non-LGBTQ people, but I always think it's important to address that specifically. So here's where that comes from. You're looking at a population of people who are very often underemployed or unemployed. Underemployment is typically employment that you have to seek or are able to seek that is underneath your level of talent or skill, especially if you have a degree or certification. And unemployment is, as it sounds, not being formally employed by a organization or an entity. What we also have to address here is unemployment is not necessarily distinguished from sex work. So very often, especially for many of our trans siblings, you might see higher rates of sex work out of necessity. And I think that is lumped in together with unemployment. I can't remember what the data is or what those data are specifically. But again, there's high rates of that for many folks in our community, in particular for folks of color who are queer or trans. So think about that. There's less money, less access to education, typically fewer resources, or there's a potential threat of losing resources connected to family or losing your job. There's still not firm employment protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender. If I have that wrong, please correct me. But generally, yeah, we don't really have that safety net, unfortunately. So if I don't have a lot of money, if it's hard to find ways to make money, and I am experiencing higher rates of anxiety and depression, therapy or going to the doctor may not be feasible. It may be too expensive. I may be subject to transphobia or homophobia just by going to the doctor and trying to get healthcare. But you know what is a lot cheaper than that? Drugs and alcohol. So it's important for us to not stigmatize substance use here, which very often happens, in particular from conservative sources. They'll see a stat like that and be like, oh, you know, y'all do more drugs because you're degenerates. And it's like, no, you treat us terribly and call us degenerates, and that's why we do more drugs. And I actually did look up some data on marijuana use over the pandemic for LGBTQ folks. And as you would guess, there are higher rates of marijuana use, in particular to self-medicate or manage daily stressors compared to non-LGBTQ people. So that connection makes a lot of sense. But all that to say, basically, is there's higher rates of distress typically for LGBTQ folks. And a lot of it exists in kind of the periphery and the background, perpetually there. Sometimes it can come from direct experiences in the past. It can come from the fear of violence. But all in all, we see these consistent trends. And one of the number one factors is how are people being treated and what is the culture like around a community that creates these kinds of circumstances. From there, we have high rates of suicidality across dimensions. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that in just a moment. But basically what we're talking about is higher rates of suicide ideation and attempts. I use trans folks as a baseline because they have the most drastic disparity of suicide attempts compared to the general population. And it informs a lot of how we understand mental health with LGBTQ folks, namely that trans folks in particular tend to face the worst outcomes, and largely due to stigmatization and discrimination in society. So what those two things are influenced by, and sometimes what they create, is fewer resources, less access to education, and under or unemployment. So what that leads me to is the fact that none of these occur in isolation. They are all connected. A question I've been asking my students to try to bring this home lately is, hey, take your gender or your race and try to exist as just that and nothing else. Typically hard to do that, right? So that points to a lot of the social construction around our identities, but also the fact that everything that we are is connected. Everything that we experience or all of our functioning is based on something that we've encountered before. Humans aren't really good at interacting with new things, and we have cognitive strategies to, you know, shoehorn new information into older schemas when we don't know what to do with them. So what that basically says is we have to take all of this together. There may be salient reasons or very distinct events that might cause some of this, but all in all, they're all wrapped up together in our experiences and how we grow. So for LGBTQ people, consider that the high rates of bullying and harassment that occur in secondary education and before, or the issues that people might face in terms of policies like bathroom policies for trans students, or the recent anti-trans bills that we've been seeing in Arkansas and unfortunately many other states. All of those have an impact on who people are, and we bring that with us wherever we go. And the same goes for anyone else of any marginalized community or identity. So all in all, what that means is it's important for us to attend to why this stuff happens in general, and then in grad school, why it may either reemerge or be exacerbated by the circumstances. So taking us to suicide, which again, if you need to check out or you need to process a different way, then I highly encourage you to do that. But what I wanted to do is show just some brief information that hopefully I think makes this a little bit clearer. So for one, the USTS was the United States Transgender Survey. Pretty sure I have that right. So I got this from a report published in 2019, but the data is from 2015. So that's why I have it up there. And then data from the Suicide Prevention Resource Center about the general population and suicide in 2019. So one of the things I like to do with people is be upfront that, hey, I have to practice these skills all the time. So if you see me misspeaking any of this data, let me know. But I think I have it right based on reading the periodical and going through these graphs as I got them ready. So let's start with the general population. In terms of suicidal thoughts, that's that blue bar right here. We have maybe a little under 12% for people who are 18 to 25. It looks like maybe between 5 and 6% for folks who are 26 to 49. And then for folks who are 50 plus, it's a little over 2%, maybe approaching 3%. So that's one part of this. And remember, that's all general population just for these different age groups. So then when we look at suicidal thoughts for trans folks, for the respondents in this study, of which there were 27,715, with a median age of 26. We see in this first group, 18 to 24, in the past year, 61% of respondents for the United States Transgender Survey indicated suicidal thoughts. Over their lifetime, that was 86.3%. So again, suicidal attempts or suicidal thoughts for trans folks or the respondents of this survey, 18 to 24, 61.2% in the past year, 86.3% in their lifetime. Compare that with the 18 to 25, almost exactly it. We have less than 11%. So we're approaching 5 to 6 times the rate, at least in the past year. And then about 7 to 8 times that for a lifetime prevalence for people in this age group. All right, so for folks 25 to 44 who responded to this survey, 43.6%, there we go, experienced suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts within the past year. 81% or 82 nearly within their lifetime. For 45 to 54, 32% in the last year, 74% over their lifetime. 55 to 64, 25% in the last year, 68% in their lifetime, and then 65 plus, 15% in the past year, and 56% over their lifetime. So of course, one of the things you see here is that as you get older, you see rates of suicidal attempts drop, but there is some heavily nuanced gendered information around suicidal attempts and lethality and ideation. So those are all things to consider, again, as folks are coming here. So the thing, or the reason I wanted to present this is that, again, with many trans folks, we see them on the extreme or the higher ends of all of these metrics of health disparities in comparison between cisgender and heterosexual folks and LGBTQ folks. And so with suicidal thoughts, we do still see the reduction over time based on age groups, but those numbers are drastically high in comparison with the general population. All right, so that's ideation, that's thoughts, which may be fleeting and they may not be acted on, but they can really wig you out, you know? From there, now I don't have information on plans. I do like that they included that with the general population, and I'll have to go back and check the resource to see if they included the information. But generally what we see with suicide attempts is that they are drastically lower compared to attempts for a number of reasons in terms of method, in terms of how quickly someone found them. There's a lot of things that can influence what happens in between an attempt and lethality. There can be a lot of intervention as long as it's quick and timely. So what we see for the general population in terms of suicide attempts is that it's a little bit under 2% if folks are 18 to 25. It might be under 1%, in between 0.5 to 1% for folks who are 26 to 49. And for folks who are 50 and older, not 50%, it looks like it's barely above 0. So that's pretty significant, right? And again, that matches trends with what we see in terms of attempts and ideation over our lifetime. So if we look at suicide attempts by age for trans folks or the respondents to the USTS survey, for folks who are 18 to 25, 10% attempted in the last year, 42% prevalence over their lifetime. 6% who were 25 to 44 attempted in the past year, 42%, again, over their lifetime. Didn't catch how similar those were. For folks who are 45 to 54, 3.2% attempted in the past year, 37.5% attempted over their lifetime. For folks who are 55 to 64, 2.1% attempted in the past year, 28% in their lifetime. And then for folks who are 65 plus, again, consistent, but still pretty drastically high compared to our general population. 0.9% attempted in the past year, 17.5% attempted over their lifetime. So what we're seeing is some very stark numbers that point to, well, just the reality that trans folks are dealing with so much that attempts and suicidal ideation are markedly prevalent compared to our general population. And again, a lot of what that can be explained by is how society treats people. In particular, trans folks do not have protections in terms of, let's see, employment, in terms of housing, healthcare, and trying to think if I'm missing any other major metric, but in general, they don't have legal protections. And folks who are gay and lesbian or bisexual, they don't have too much more than that. So what we're looking at is a situation that is heavily created by policy and by culture that exists around us. And one way to bring this home is I was looking at a study within the past few years, and basically it was talking about rates of anxiety or depression in areas where there were protections for being LGBTQ or when there were not. So as you would imagine, in rates or in areas where there were fewer protections or no protections, the rates of mental illness were significantly high, including comorbidity among different experiences. So I can't remember if they delineated that specifically, but comorbidity basically just means two co-occurring diagnoses that are distinct and independent of each other typically, but that can still be justifiably, or that someone can still be justifiably diagnosed as. So again, without those protections, or in areas that don't have those protections or that are openly hostile, mental health issues for LGBTQ people are significantly higher compared to other areas, and especially compared to cisgender and heterosexual folks. Okay, so with all of that being said, I kept asking myself, what are some major issues for LGBTQ grad students? I can definitely think of my own. I can't remember if there were other queer trans people with me in the program when I was going through school, maybe one or two, but not too many more than that. So there were very few of us. But there's a particular point I want to get to toward the end that kind of brings this home. So in general, I was thinking about my own experiences, the research I've read, going through different periodicals or different organizations. And here's kind of what I narrowed down. For one, navigating identity and development. And one of y'all said that as well. So here's the thing about coming out and identity. We are constantly doing it in a cisnormative and a heteronormative society. And so having to come out all the time is quite frankly exhausting. But what happens in college and grad school is that there's more of an opportunity to do that. You don't have to be with your family. There's different opportunities for financial safety or security. So people who are in college have more room to navigate their identity and figure out where they are. That can just be a little bit difficult sometimes in front of other people, especially as your appearance or different aspects of yourself might change publicly. Finding research mentors, which I think someone else might have mentioned. It's not always easy to figure out not just who has your interest in mind in terms of what you want to study, but also who's going to be willing to support you and not be homophobic or transphobic or biphobic or acephobic in the process. So basically someone who's going to respect you in terms of your ideas, your intelligence, your budding expertise, and your identities. And it can be really difficult to see who's willing to do that or able to do it. Finding what to research can be really tricky. I definitely felt this, or I felt it as a Black and queer person. But something I see in literature around folks from marginalized communities, especially in research programs, is that sometimes the expectation is that we study stuff on us. Now, here's the deal. I definitely felt that, and I also felt like it was necessary. Luckily, I love this, and I love finding out new ways to understand people, because that just means I have new ways to know how to treat them better. So thinking about my own experiences, I did feel the pressure to study Blackness or queerness, but I also wanted to. I wanted that kind of research to be behind my name as I went out into the world, not just to show people what I was passionate about, but also to show them that, well, no, I can do this and I know how to effectively study my own community, you know, which we don't have a lot of. But there's that expectation, and sometimes it can be really unfair. So we shouldn't expect people to just study their communities, because we don't expect that of cisgender people, we don't expect that of white people, we don't expect that of abled people, or anyone else in a position of power or privilege. And those are kind of the folks who need to be doing the research and learning more. But one of the caveats is sometimes when folks outside of a community do research on a different community, it's not always the best. So again, it can be a little difficult or precarious to figure out, how do I want to do this and where do I want to go with my own research? Financial support. So sometimes that can be based on funding for a department or a college or university. Other times it may be due to family. So if there's not a lot of funding available in a department and family is unaffirming, it can be really hard to find funding sources to keep you in school. And money is going to be a particular issue for all marginalized communities. But again, for trans folks and for queer folks, where we experience higher rates of unemployment and underemployment or high rates of mental illness, the financial aspect can add another major layer of problems for us. Familial support, similar to that, not having the support of your family, maybe in terms of going to school, which I understand is still a Southern thing in some ways, but also family supporting you in terms of your identities. if you are not out to them, will they withdraw help or support, financially, physically, or emotionally, once you do so? It would be really crappy to have to leave a graduate program in the middle of it because your family won't pay for school. And that is a very real reality for many queer and trans folks. From there, marginalization within programs. So do faculty members or other students say things that are homophobic or transphobic? Are they dismissive of your experiences and ideas, especially if you speak up about them? Do you have the room to speak up about them in your environment without reprisal or without any kind of retaliation? And someone rescinding care and nurture, even in an academic STEM or perspective, is retaliation. So how do you navigate that and figure out, is this a problem? Am I afraid it's a problem? Or, you know, how much caution or care do I need to exercise? I think hypervigilance can be a very appropriate word here, because that may be necessary sometimes to protect yourself as you're getting your education. And then from there, just marginalization in general. You know what? School is already stressful enough. Finding out what to research, preparing for comps or quals, doing a thesis or dissertation. There's a lot to contend with. Well, let's say I'm in Mashburn all day and I'm doing all this rigorous stuff in terms of my science and research. That can be rewarding, but it's still mental energy, right? Well, if I leave and I get called a homophobic slur, that probably did not make my day better. In fact, if I'm already exhausted, it probably made it a lot worse. Well, it's not just the experiences in the program that matter. It's what is happening out. What are the things that we're carrying with us all the time? What do we need to process in terms of being healthy and whole and authentic with other people? And do we have the room to do that? So it's not just understanding how our identities come into play in these specific programs, but it's also looking at, well, how does my culture treat me? How does my society treat me? And what do those experiences, especially the negative ones, mean for me as I come back to the program day by day in an effort to get my degree? So the last thing I'll leave you with here is this real? And I asked that question because here's the deal. Like I said, I came up with this using my own experiences, using some research and periodicals I've seen, looking over information from different organizations. But, and again, please let me know if I'm wrong and share this with me if you find it. There's not a lot out there about LGBTQ grad students. And that comes from a couple of places. For one, there's not a whole lot of research or data on LGBTQ college students in general. Many colleges do not collect data around gender or sexual orientation, which effectively renders a population invisible. So let's think about retention in that case. If you're focused on retention and you notice that there are certain trends emerging for different groups, namely groups of color, then it's a lot easier to put something into play, right? But if you're not asking about queerness or transness, then you miss that information. You don't know if retention or issues with retention for a community are being guided by it if you're not getting the metrics. And it can feel really unsafe, but we still need it. We just need to find ways to protect people and to stop folks from outside the university from being able to use that knowledge to weaponize it against our students, our faculty, or our staff. And so on the whole, there's not a whole lot of information about LGBTQ grad students specifically. Again, because we're not measuring those experiences. So when that happens, what kind of harm are we doing? Or what kinds of barriers are we creating for people just by virtue of not asking about who they are? I know there's a lot of reasons to be afraid of that, but maybe it turns out that it's still important to get it, because otherwise we don't know what the actual issues are to be able to help any group or community. So to me, it's important to collect the data. And luckily, UCA actually is. So that's, you know, a really great move on our part. So ultimately then, what do you do in talking about this stuff or in navigating these different identities? It can be hard to figure out what to do. If you're queer or trans, you may not know what resources to find or who can be a bastion of hope and safety for you. If you're not queer or trans, you may be unsure how to say things in class. I started this presentation with, hey, I'd love for you to ask me questions, especially difficult ones. Just be mindful of language. And you might have thought, well, what if the words I use are actually the wrong words? And how do I know? And I'm not sure what to say. It can be really hard to find out what to do. But I think there's some things that can help us. For one, I do have a couple of lists for you that might be beneficial. But from there, I think it's just considering that our experiences are mobile, they're dynamic, they are never the same from day to day, sometimes not even from moment to moment. If you've ever been wigged out because your emotions were in one place at the start of the day and then a completely different place, maybe the next hour or at the end of the day, I am here to tell you that is incredibly human. It is not always fun, but it's human. Our emotions change all the time because our brain is designed to respond to things in our environment. So we respond to different stimuli. And sometimes what we're responding to may not be in our awareness, but it's still something that our brain attached to and that caught our attention. So all that being said, it can be really difficult sometimes to think about in a world where homo antagonism and trans antagonism and trans misogyny and bi erasure and ace erasure are happening on a global scale, you may not always know what to do. But that's where I want you to remember that, yes, we are individuals at odds with systems, but our individual behaviors do matter for the people who are in our spheres of influence, for the people in our circles, and just in general for the people around us. So I don't have a handy dandy answer for you that is absolute and unequivocal, but I do have some pointers that maybe can help you along the way. So first off, for folks who are fam, if you are LGBTQ, here's what I recommend to you. For one, remember that it is unfair and unjust to ask you to acclimate to a society and culture that harms you or disavows your existence. If you ever wake up and you worry how people are going to treat you, or if they're going to treat you poorly, or what terrible thing may happen to me, for one, that sucks. And I hope that you don't have to live like that every day. And from there, it's real and it's hard to get rid of those questions knowing that it's a possibility. But you're not supposed to just acclimate. You're not supposed to assimilate. You deserve the room and freedom to be who you are. So remember that it's unfair and unjust to ask you to do anything but show up and be authentic and be okay with who you are. From there, find sources of support and collaboration. Figure out who can help you. Maybe it's not someone in your department. It could be someone across campus, who knows? It could be another classmate, or maybe someone in a different cohort above or below you. But regardless, see if there's people you can work with who support you in your experiences and who are willing to do research with you or group projects, because it's helpful to have folks who we know are always going to work with us and do a good job. Be willing to be confident. Here's the deal. I'm not saying, muster up all this courage and say, screw you world, I'm going to do what I want to. But, I do kind of encourage that. Just, walk as safely as you can. But be willing to be confident and stand up and say, no, my voice and my ideas matter. And so you're going to hear them. Our cisgender and heterosexual compatriots definitely do it. So I think we deserve some of that luxury too. Recognize the price of confidence too. For a marginalized community. So that's the other side, the other edge of this sword. Because yes, I do encourage you to be confident. And yes, I also recognize that depending on who you are, confidence can create a target on your back, especially for trans folks, especially for queer and trans people of color, especially for disabled queer and trans folks. Being able to stand up and say who you are and what your piece is valuable. And it can also prompt violence for you. So it can be difficult to navigate, but I do still encourage you to do it and recognize, hey, what is the price to that? And can I pay it? From there, choose how you want to move. If you want to be in the background and not do a whole lot, I think that's perfectly fine. Again, I think it's wrong to expect us to constantly be bastions of activism for LGBTQ folks. We kind of do it out of necessity because otherwise it won't happen, but you don't have to show up and do that in every space. It's okay for you to stop working sometimes and just be. So with that being said, fight when you can and when you need to. And remember what battles have to be fought versus which ones may be wise to let go. This one is difficult for me because it's hard for me to say that to people that I have positions of privilege or power over. But then I have to remember being Black and gay is its own very particular experience, especially in America. So I do have to pick my battles and I do have to choose, do I want to fight today and be exhausted, or do I want to take the L and go home and cry about it or watch TV? It sucks and it's unfair to have to navigate that, but picking your battles is wise, and we are not made to fight every single battle, but that's where collaborators and co-conspirators come in. Find your way to do all of these your way. Figure out what it looks like for you. Figure out what it means for you and how you can show up. Just do it with your own flair because it makes you more likely to do it and be successful when you try it. And lastly, take up space. Please just take up space. I struggled with that for a long time and I didn't always use my voice. And here you see me using it in spades. But I always encourage you to take up space and I want you to be safe when you do it. I hope that is what you are met with and that you're not met with violence or antagonism. But regardless, do it. because what you might find is that maybe somebody else needed to see you do it. Maybe you needed to see you do it. And ultimately, you deserve it. If you are in these graduate programs, especially paying money to be in them and devoting your scholarship and skills to a department and helping them enhance how they do scholarship, which is what happens with new cohorts of graduate students, then yeah, you deserve the space to be yourself. And if it's not offered to you, snatch it up yourself. All I ask is that you don't harm anybody else in the process. So from there, for folks who are outside the community, I have some similar feedback for you. For one, again, remember that it is unfair and unjust to ask someone to acclimate to a society and culture that harms them or disavows their existence. Learn about LGBTQ experiences and try your best to do that with as little human interaction as possible. What I mean by that is it's easy to make LGBTQ folks the experts in a way that is not helpful. And sometimes we can ask questions that maybe we don't need to, that are a Google search away. So use those information literacy skills that you gained before grad school and are honing in grad school, and figure out how to learn this information without putting the onus on someone from the community. Be willing to be a collaborator or a co-conspirator when needed. So find out ways to help folks and help be accomplices to their needs and their experiences, and be quiet sometimes in that process. So for you, also be willing to be confident, because using your power and privilege is not something that we're used to do, especially to help people who don't have those same experiences. So with that being said, also find opportunities to leverage your own privilege or power to help LGBTQ people. Maybe you speak up and say something in class. Maybe you are the one who's willing to broach the difficult topic and not make an LGBTQ person have to do that. But figure out how you can do that too. And also choose how you want to move. Who is the person that you want to be? If you say that you want to be an ally, which I'm going to be honest with you is one of my least favorite words, because people who are allies in terms of behavior and actual like camaraderie and companionship, they show up and they never ask for that word. And so instead of using it, especially as an identity marker, which it is not, what I encourage you to do is just find ways to be there for people, and ultimately choose how you want to do that. Choose how you want to move. Fight when you can and when you need to, and remember what battles have to be fought versus which ones may be wise to let go. And also remember that when you don't exist on these axes of marginalization, you may have more energy to do so. Now, here's the deal. Maybe you're Black. Maybe you're a cisgender woman. Maybe you are Muslim or Buddhist. Maybe you are disabled. You are blind or deaf, or you have mobility issues, or you are unable to integrate your sensory experience. Those are all things to take note of too. And so it's not an either or. It's not if you are not LGBTQ, you always have to do this and disregard your other identities. Remember, all of us is connected, and all of that has to be taken into consideration. So maybe there's a neurotypical LGBTQ person who can go up for you when you need it, in the way that you as a neurotypical or neuroatypical cisgender or heterosexual person can go up for them when they need it. It's about collaboration and building community, not compartmentalization or either or. And again, find your way to do all of these. What is your way to approach this? What is your strategy for doing this? When you find that, you can do it well, and you tend to be more successful. Then lastly, yield the floor, yield the mic, and yield the space. Coming from a privileged perspective, it's really easy to always feel like you have to be heard or that you need to be heard. But maybe sometimes it's important for other people to have the mic, to be able to express their own views or guide the conversation. Especially if you're really opinionated, if you are cisgender and or heterosexual here, recognizing that, of course, there's a lot of nuances there. What I do recommend is figure out when it's important for you to step back, and then when it's important for you to use your voice. All right, so with all that being said, that covers just about everything I needed to today. But I'm curious to hear what's on your mind, or what do you have questions about as we wrap up this presentation, which I am very grateful to have done with y'all today.
Dr. Thomas, thank you for using your voice and taking up your space this afternoon. I think that very informative, and I really appreciate all of the ideas and just the vulnerability and the honesty that is represented with how you're sharing those ideas. So I very much appreciate that. I hope that folks will take a moment to put some comments or questions in the chat. That usually takes a few minutes. I'm curious, as you work with you've been on UCA's campus now for quite a while, and you've worked in a lot of different roles. I'm curious if there are typical types of questions that you get from our UCA students, undergraduate or graduate, when you find yourself in spaces like this, working with students.
It ranges depending on what I cover in the presentation. A lot of the time it might be around, hey, is it okay to use this term, or when is it not okay to use this term? What are unhelpful terms about a community, or what do you think of this experience? I've gotten some really good ones recently from my first year students. Like during our summer start program, someone asked about, trying to remember a good one. Can't remember a specific one, but a lot of good stuff about gender and sexual orientation in the context of our culture. Or recently, I had a student ask about, do LGBTQ people feel antagonistic feelings toward Christianity? And, so we discussed briefly the role of spirituality and religion for a lot of people in terms of creating marginalization, but also in terms of creating a home. So it can range, but they're usually pretty curious questions about, well, how do we approach this?
Nice. Well, to our folks in the audience, please take a moment to either use the Q&A to ask a question, or just offer a comment, or even the chat. I will say, Dr. Thomas, that earlier this week, I was in a session, not anything affiliated with UCA. It's more of my own professional organization, and we were having a conversation, and the question was asked, do you feel that we are doing better? So in terms of building this community, the ideas that you're sharing, do you feel like we're doing better? And so we were thinking about that in terms of our own discipline, but I'm curious if you have a response just to that question in general.
We really are. What I love hearing is, especially in mental health, a lot of people are looking at changing their intake forms, which is, we disregard it, but it's one of the first things that people see that lets them know if they belong there or if they don't. So changing forms, last night's coming out of it was excellent. Today's Pride Walk was excellent. And so there have definitely been some missteps over the past few years, but when I think about the number of queer and trans students we have who are much more open, who are visible on campus, it lifts my heart, because I remember when it wasn't like that. And I was around when PRISM was a little bit more active in undergrad. So it's been really wonderful to see how many more of us there are. And you can see that in the student body, and I really appreciate that.
Okay. We do have one question, actually a couple of questions. And so maybe if you can hit both of these before we get out. One is just ways to be more helpful, examples of problematic ally behavior to avoid. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
So I'll try to keep that one brief, because it can easily get into something.
Sure, that's a whole nother, yeah.
Right. So I think one of the best things that I did in terms of learning about women's experiences, misogynoir, so the differential marginalization of Black women, Twitter and social media. It is low impact. You can learn from people. I do encourage you to, practice some reflection as you read it, but find folks who are online who are either writing or talking about this, because they're offering up their time, in a world that doesn't value it. In terms of problematic behavior, that one can be a little bit tricky because it varies person by person. But I would encourage you to find information about stuff that is actively marginalizing for people. So the little stuff to the big stuff. Like, I don't like the assumption that I'm heterosexual because I really like being gay. So that would be a little one. A big one would be complete dismissal or disregarding of my sexual orientation or someone's gender identity. So it can take a little bit more time to figure out what's helpful there, but I think that's where following people or seeing social media from folks in the community can help you learn a lot of that stuff. And of course, if you ever have questions about something specific, always feel free to hit me up.
Okay. One question on here I'm going to answer very quickly, and then I'll throw you the last one, and then we'll wrap it up. So this question that I'm going to answer is around the diplomas. So here at UCA, it is not a requirement that your diploma have your legal name. So when you get ready to graduate and you complete your application to graduate, you put in what we call your diploma name. So I wanted to just answer that very quickly.
Mhm.
And then the last question that we'll wrap this up with, is there a place for LGBTQ plus students to find information on safe spaces or friendly professors, faculty, or staff? Like where is a safe or brave space for students? How do they get that information?
So I'm going to put something in here, the Campus Pride Index. So that's something we're working on for UCA as well. So I'm also on the Diversity Advisory Council LGBTQ subcommittee, and that's one of our major goals over the next year to get that filled out. But there's information on different schools where they fall on certain metrics. That's one indication. Another one is just word of mouth, figuring out, hey, did this instructor respect someone else's gender pronouns? Did this person talk positively about being queer, trans in class? What kinds of things came up? Or did students feel like they had the space to be open and be upfront? And then lastly, one thing you can look for is a safe zone sticker. You might see a triangle, you might see a bear paw, something in rainbow, but it'll say, you know, safe zone or safe space on it. We have had formal training around that in the past. I can't remember if Charlotte Strickland has picked that back up. But you may see people with that sticker, and that's usually an indication that someone has either gone through the training or that they are supportive and affirming of folks who are queer, trans. So there's a lot of little things to look for. Of course, there's not always an official channel, but sometimes you can find out information more directly by talking to people who've taken an instructor before, or just listening for how do they treat folks.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Thomas, thank you again for your time this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I know the folks in our audience appreciate it as well. And hopefully we will see you again soon.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. It was really great to share this space with y'all. So thank you, Dr. Barlow, for this, and for Sydney, who reached out to me and was super helpful for getting this organized. Really appreciate all you did, Sydney. So yeah, with that, y'all take care.
Yeah, have a great evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.